Hello, good evening, and welcome to today's session on BIC Streams, Shaping India's Urban Life, Mainstreaming the Discipline of Urban Design. Joining us today are our panelists Brinda Somaya, Neelkant Chaya, Rahul Mehrotra, and this discussion is moderated by Prem Chandawakar. We will be posting the full bios of our speakers on the chat box that you see at the bottom of your screen. Do post your questions, comments, or anything else, observations in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen as well. With that, welcome everyone, and over to you, Prem.
Thank you, Raghu. We're talking about urban design today, which is a discipline that forms a bridge between architecture and urban planning. Architecture doesn't just resolve functional problems, it also looks at the three-dimensional character of culture, aesthetics, and experience. But it does not do this at the urban scale, focusing primarily on individual land parcels. Urban planning examines wider questions of the city, but tends to cast a two-dimensional gaze of policy abstractions about land use, traffic flow, and so on. Urban design seeks to combine the two, concerned about urban scale, while also concerned about three-dimensional form and aesthetic and cultural experience. Urban design works as a bridge discipline between urban planning and architecture, defining the quality, history, and specificity of neighborhoods. The three disciplines of urban planning, urban design, and architecture are meant to work in tandem, each affecting and informing the other, to lay down an ethical, social, and cultural ideal of urban life. Sadly, urban design is a discipline largely unrecognized and unimplemented in India. Very few planning authorities have departments of urban design or even commission much urban design work from the private sector. Moreover, we lack an imagination of the city. We locate our culture in the village, and we tend to view the city as a techno-economic entity viewed through an abstract and bureaucratic frame of building codes. We do not see it as either a cultural or an ecological entity. This discussion will reflect on what good urban design should be and examine key questions in this respect on how we can mainstream it in the Indian city, while retaining the vibrance of informal urbanism and other characteristics of the Indian city. We have three panelists today who are not only eminent in their field, but what is interesting and unusual is that all three of them combine practice and academia. Rahul Mehrotra teaches urban design and urban planning at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, and also has a reputed architectural practice based in Mumbai. Neelkant Chaya was the Dean of the School of Architecture at CEPT University in Ahmedabad, and has also been a practitioner throughout his career. Brinda Somaya runs one of Mumbai's well-known practices working on campus development, heritage conservation in the urban realm, and a whole host of other projects, and is also a visiting faculty at colleges of architecture, both in India and overseas. The format is that each speaker will give a presentation of about 10 minutes each. After that, we will have a moderated discussion amongst the panelists. And finally, we will field questions from the audience. Please post your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, but in the Q&A box. And we will select questions to read out in the final section. With that, I'll ask Rahul Mehrotra to set the ball rolling with his presentation. Over to you, Rahul.
Thank you very much, Prem. Let me just share my screen. Thank you, Prem. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. Great to be here with Brinda and with Neelkant. And I look forward to a wonderful session. So, I'm taking the mandate you gave me, Prem, very seriously. And as an introduction, really presenting more an academic perspective, although, as you know, and as you've mentioned, that my interest is also in practice. But I think for the sake of the panel, I'm wearing the hat really of an academic. So I want to kind of start by putting a question on the table, which I hope we can pick up. And Prem, this is to your reference of urban design as a bridge discipline. I would say urban design is a bridge practice. I'm not sure we can call urban design a discipline. And that might be an interesting thing to discuss, because I think it places it completely differently in terms of its proactiveness. So it is really, as you said, bridging the site specificity of architecture and the abstraction of planning. And, it's interesting that urban design, started in the late 1950s, 1960 at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. And it was started by Jose Luis Sert as a program and as a definition even of a field of practice. And he was really reacting to the urbanism, both in the peripheries of North America, but also what was happening to the devastation of its cities through renewal and all of that. And his drive was to really give it coherence. That was the origins of urban design. And there are many interesting histories that have been written, and it's fascinating to read, for example, in the archives, how the definition of urban design sort of oscillated between civic design and urban design. That was a major debate. And Sert clearly saw synthesis at the heart of what he called urban design, a synthesis between disciplines. And this led in the 1960s, as I said, to the creation of an interdisciplinary program at the GSD in urban design, which was founded, I believe, on humanism. And it's very interesting, again, if you look at the archives, that a core required course, which was an integrative course in the program in the 1960s, was called the human scale. That was almost the starting point to imagine what the urban, in terms of urban design, might be. And so these are just some images from the archives of Gideon's classes and Sert standing there and teaching, etc. Now, today, there's a lot that has happened. And today, advanced capitalism with neoliberal policies and democracy, that's a potent cocktail when you have neoliberalism and democracy, a hellish combination for urban form more generally and urban design as we imagine its practice. And what has resulted from this are boundaries of containment between planning and architecture, completely in contradiction to the bridge metaphor that Sert used. And that's why I think the word practice is more apt, because urban design is a bridge practice, one that implies flows and is open, a practice that's plastic and reconfigures itself depending on the problem, the agents, the actors, the constituencies it wants to influence. And plastic enough even to configure and reconfigure itself between form and the broader ecologies of the natural systems in which it is situated. Currently, what we see as urban design practice is pandering to capital in unprecedented ways, what I call the architecture and urban form of impatient capital. Naturally, this has its operating logic, as does capital, which is intrinsically impatient and assumes some form of patience as it resides in universities or foundations or in the custody of civil society. Thus, they create the best forms of architecture and urban form in campuses, for example, or at least sometimes. So capital, on account of its impatience, creates an architecture and urban form that is often whimsical, often vendor-driven, often not human-centric. It's sort of premised on the ease of construction and spectacle. And it results in urban design practices getting obsessively and largely driven by typological concerns, or put another way, they become large architecture projects. They become largely architectural centric. And urban design and planning are clearly practices and disciplines engaged in the public. So what does this shift in the culture of city development mean really for urban design? In fact, the sense of disengagement and reality has attracted criticisms of what urban design has come to mean. And the many forms of readings of urbanism that is emerging around the world, it has really served as a critique on the unrealized potential, I believe, of urban design to engage in more substantial ways in placemaking. And what is ironic is that perhaps urban design as a practice is the only one that extends urbanism on the ground, on the field. The usage of urbanism, at least for me, implies a passive field of study, observational. The dictionary defines it as a study of cities or city life, depending on the context it's used. Urban design with the prefix of urban to design makes it more pointed to the design, to the operational versus the observational of the urban. Herbert Simon's The Science of the Artificial has long been considered a seminal text for a design theorists and researchers anxious to establish both the scientific status for design and the most inclusive possible definition for a designer. Embodied in Simon's often cited quote, "Everyone designs who devises courses of actions aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones." Thus, for me, I go back to the definition, Prem, of urban design. Besides its activism dimension of closing feedback loops between planning and architecture, is necessarily explicitly human-centric, a field of contestation where resolution is manifest by the resolution of spatial imagination coupled with the design of process. I see advocacy as being integral part of the practice of urban design. In fact, and that's the reason why one reinforces the notion of practice. In fact, I see urban design as being about activism, about drawing the disciplines of architecture, landscape, and planning closer together, and being the conduit for the critical feedback loops on which the survival and improvement of our cities and broader landscapes depend. Patrick Geddes, I think, was a great urban designer. Today, technology can be appropriate as a field for urban design in order to enhance the process of this feedback loop and kind of facilitate the notion of activism. So I think, again, to come back to the notion of practice, the tense relationship between disciplines is something that must be respected and still persists. Disciplinary knowledge and its integrity actually makes its crossovers more robust. And that's why if urban design situated itself as a discipline, it would close its boundaries off rather than be the bridge practice metaphor. But this integrity must resist the simplistic impulses of branding. The urban designer is really a contemporary practicing polymath, one who directs dialogues-based processes. For in imagining spatial possibilities means directing movement, lifestyles, morals, and the interaction of individuals. This renders urban design highly influential and making the notion of the polymath particularly important. Naturally, the definition of the urban then is the category that needs expansion. And I'm going to, in this second part, very quickly put on the table three concepts that kind of might root it more to the Indian city, but they have to do with the definition of the urban, because if we want to add design to urban, we must know also what is urban for a very particular context. And so the first concept is beyond the urban-rural binary. You already alluded to it, of ephemeral urbanism and the notion of the design of transitions. So in India, what is urban becomes a huge question because there is a kind of sense of flux. We can claim that India is 30% urban for half the year and 60% urban for the other half. And this suggests the urbanization in India is as much about people moving to places we consider cities as it is about people changing the villages. How smart will be the governing structure to imagine this transition becomes a very critical question. And surely permanence of urban form is not the sole solution to this flux. And it is here we should look at the temporal landscape as a productive category beyond what I call, or what we all call, the informal city. So it means changing the discourse in that sense because of this sort of notion of flux. The second is the notion of ephemeral urbanism, which I think is a very useful category for us to redefine what we mean by the urban in the context of India. And in my view, the framing of this phenomena under the rubric of temporal landscapes, the ephemeral or the kinetic city, is more inspirational than categories of the informal cities, or using the word informal because that poses it as a binary to the formal. This is not an argument for making our cities temporary, rather one for recognizing the temporal as an integral part of the city and seeing what spaces exist for this within the possibilities of urban design imagination, all the way from urban form, public spaces, to even governance structures. That is, how do we embed softer, but perhaps more robust systems in more permanent built form of cities? That is, approaches which allow spaces to be adjusted, reprogrammed with new activities, not foreseen, not necessarily even planned. Ephemeral urbanism as an idea acknowledges the need for re-examining permanent solutions as the only mode for the formulation of the urban imaginary, and instead imagining new protocols that are constantly reformulated and readapted and projected in a kind of iterative search for an equilibrium that reacts to a permanent state of crisis. And the last point I just want to quickly make, and here even architecture is not the spectacle of the city, and it really challenges the notion of the city as a static and a stable entity. And this really unsettles us as architects and by extension, urban designers. And the last notion is that of the absolute and the transition, because transition design acknowledges that we're living in transitional times. And the scholar Irving Kossoff and Skupel have written a lot about this, because it takes as its central premise the need for societal transitions to more sustainable futures, and argues that design has a key role to play in these transitions. It applies an understanding of interconnectedness of social, economic, political, and natural systems to address this problem. Transition design advocates the reconception of lifestyles, the aim of making them more place-based and participatory, and harmonizing them with the natural environment. And so just to end, I just want to sort of show you this diagram, which my colleagues at the GSD, Peter Rowe and Yun Fu made, which is a wonderful mapping of from Siam. You have two axes, which is outcome oriented, which is object-oriented and process-oriented. And from Siam to the 1950s at Harvard, at the Harvard conference that led to urban design to high modernism, it was always outcome-oriented. And then in the 70s, you had the shift to participatory design, which was all about process. In the postmodernism, you had product. But what you see is the graph and the curve is flattening. And now you're beginning to be at a moment where ecological concerns because of climate change open up new definitions for what urban design might mean and what it might embrace. And it's a good recap of really the history of urban design as it's practiced. And so in conclusion, I think urban design today, especially in the global arena, has evolved into new hybrid forms of practice, which often result in richer versions of earlier conventional practices. In this, the practice has transformed to become more inclusive, thereby recognizing the dependency on other actors, agencies for implementation, and multiple domains for its design. Integral to this new emerging approach are incremental strategies, multifaceted feedback loops, making the process of urban design increasingly dynamic. New technologies facilitate a more nuanced, fine-grained, grounded register of the reality. So then urban design is about how spatial possibilities play out to influence the quality of lives, our economy, society, evolving culture, and the broader well-being of the planet. And so put another way, urban design in this sort of time of change, uncertainty, and flux could truly be a stabilizing armature for uncertainty. And I think what I've put up on the screen are, I think, the critical urban design challenges for the future: to deal with flux, to intersect with nature, systemic problems of inequity, new forms of technology, to move from the critical to the propositional, which means to be more a thermostat versus being a thermometer, which we often tend to be. The critical is an easier space to reside in. And lastly, who is our client, especially in models of deep democracy, which is, I think, the role of patronage is critical in defining what urban design might mean. So thank you very much. I'm sorry if I went a few minutes over.
Yeah, thank you, Rahul. Now, if I can request Neelkanth Chhaya to.
Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me, Prem, and thank you, Rahul, for building up the base on which much of what I will talk about is connected. In fact, I'll be mostly talking about what you talked about in the second part, but in a slightly different register. So first of all, what is the Indian city like, or what has it been like over all these years? I'd like to pick out a few characteristics. First of all, it's characterized by immense diversity. There's economic diversity, there's technological differences in what people have and don't have. There are cultural diversities, languages, hundreds of them, food, habits of life, religion, all of these are in the city. You would find a huge amount of diversity, which is difficult to hold together. Second, the cities, especially in the last 100 years, have been the theaters of dissent. They have been the places which have not yet been systematized or made uniform, as was done in other parts of the world, where there was a possibility or there was an effort to systematize life. Whereas in India, neither the state, nor the market, nor religion, neither of these three forces was able to systematize and make uniform the city. And therefore, when we say urban design, we are faced with a huge variety of situations. Third, the Indian city is not compact or definable only in terms of the city, but has always had a number of sub-centers all around it. And it is distributed over space. And this, if we look at the trends over the last few years and see the projections of the coming times, this is going to increase. It will persist and increase. So you won't have definable cities as much as landscapes across which human settlements are distributed and therefore are difficult to give form to. So urban design, which gives form to definite and locatable situations, here has a very different animal to deal with. It's difficult to give form to also because aesthetically, ethically, and philosophically, we do not very easily subscribe to the possibility of a final perfection. That always there is something which is reaching, maybe going towards the perfect. And in all the arts, including, let's say, music, for example, where you will say you are trying to reach this point of perfection, but you never or hardly ever reach it. And that is not the point. It is the enjoyment of that process which is going on, which becomes the dream of the Indian psyche. And I think this, therefore, the manifested city, which can never be perfect, but is trying to reach higher levels of perfection, is in constant transformation. And this is the very joy of it. And then last, we seem to be more interested in patterns in time rather than patterns over space. We are interested in festivals, we are interested in calendar, we are interested in cycles and times of the life. We are interested more in the 16 stages of life, etc., etc. So we are interested in time and structuring time rather than structuring space. Are all these characteristics good or bad? From a certain point of view, they are bad because they make it very difficult to hold things together. Efficiency is reduced, perhaps, but in another point of view, they are very good. These conditions, these same conditions of diversity, of dissent, all these conditions, they are good conditions because they give agency to individuals and human groups, small groups, not large ones. And it is this sense of free agency, of interactive life, rather than life which is systematized and going as per routines, that makes the city something which is so wonderfully alive. And so you can look at it both ways. And I suggest that the discipline of urban design, as it has come from a background of a certain kind, tends to look at the Indian city with a degree of problematization, which says, here is something which is not working as well as it should. And that is where I think we might have to leave that question for the moment. What are the modes of design? We used to think that the state or the market or the market authorize an expert to study a problem and come out with solutions to the problem. And it was thought that even for cities, the same thing could happen. That you could have the state, a centralized power, you could have the market, more or less centralized in terms of the movement of capital, centralized top-down authorization of design moves is something which we used to consider the best form of design. However, there are earlier systems which are different. There used to be a loose kind of coalition, a loose grouping of local expertise of different kinds. People who knew the land, people who knew the flow of the water, people who knew what plants would grow, people who knew how to move materials from here to there, people who knew how to use language to make relations possible, all of that. So that the resource interactions, the material interactions, and the human interactions all had their different points of action. And there were hundreds of people dispersed in a society who would work within the framework, a loose framework, which was given by the governing authority, normally a king. Now, of course, there were problems with that, because what that did was it fractured the communities, and caste, gender, economic inequality, all of these became injustices which were endemic to many of these societies, including India. And we do have to get over that. But that whether we need to create an independent, freestanding design profession free of the embedded thinking in the local is something which we need to consider. Whether we need to bring design in that way, or whether we should have, again, groupings. For example, in Ahmedabad, there used to be something called the Sunday market. And we once inquired how they run it. And they have their own systematic grouping. It's a democratic group. They make their own decisions. They organize the space of the market. And it used to be a wonderfully organized market, which Rahul will probably remember. And there are other situations. For example, every Garba time, there is a way in which my local street next door is able to organize the activity of Garba every night. And they will stop the traffic for a certain number of hours. They'll do everything that an urban designer might have done of making the street workable for the Garba event. So there are ways in which there need not be an independent and separate authority, but there might be something where the facilitation that is given by some kind of wider knowledge would help the groups to start becoming more active for themselves. In conclusion, what I'd like to say is that we are probably looking for a new kind of aesthetic and a new kind of ethic for the urban design activity or practice, as Rahul calls it. First of all, it will not be visually based. It will not be object based, but it will be action based, how to harmonize actions of various kinds of people, It will give agency to people to take part in organizing action. And because it gives agency, it also demands a responsiveness in each citizen, a responsibility for nurturing this act of harmonizing, which means, in short, that we will have to distribute the activity of urban design throughout society. And I believe that while higher education may deal with urban design at one level, there is also a need for an entire educational process that is happening in the schools, for example. Just as we need to start understanding our interactions with ecological systems, we also need to start understanding how we source water, how it reaches people, how we keep the city clean, how do we create less friction between people who are on the move, etc. And I think this is something that schools can definitely take up, and the citizen then becomes part of the process of urban design just as much as the specialized expertise that you gain at another level helps the participants to understand each other's ideas and maybe makes it possible for the conversation about what the city should be to be more informed at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Chaya. Brinda, over to you.
Good evening, everybody. I would first like to thank the Bangalore International Center and Frame for inviting me for this presentation. Before I show a few slides, I would like to say a few words. Today's topic is so wide that I will concentrate on my city, Mumbai, and my work in it as an architect, urban designer, and planner, as one has to be able to work understanding these multiple roles that we need to play. And finally, most importantly, the role and importance of the citizen of our cities, the people who inhabit it. There is no doubt that today, for various reasons, our influence on society as architects is diminishing. We have to broaden our role to affect positive change. Today, see us architects having a vital role in shaping our environment and going beyond the design of individual buildings. We have to establish systems and principles for the growth and organization of our city and our environment. So do we have a role to play in the environment of the poor? Today, the domain of most architectural work is the marketplace of India's affluent middle class. Hotels, offices, housing, factories, and recreational buildings form the bulk of this work. Jane Jacobs, author of The Death and Life of Great American Cities, gives us architects no less an important message with her book, Systems of Survival. She identifies two ways of looking at the world, two moral syndromes, the commercial and the guardian, that underlines all work. She believes architects come under the guardian syndrome, and to get back our rightful role in society, we have to guard the public realm and interest. I also believe the need is for professional concern with the environment and improved quality of human life for all Indians, and hence the need to train a new kind of professional who can intervene and be effective within our poverty-stricken framework, both in the rural and urban areas. We now need designers who can plan and implement new ideas. And it is clear that if we follow the role of the traditional architect, we cannot meet this need. We have to go beyond buildings and work with programs that transform society. The limitations of a developing economy can actually result in a creative response rather than constraints in our work. So design has to be part of a process. As we hopefully move towards a circular economy, we need to restore, reuse, repair, retrofit our grand and ordinary buildings in our cities. The embodied energy that exists in our buildings must be saved. The construction industry is responsible for 40% of global carbon dioxide and other greenhouse emissions, 50% of primary energy consumption, and 50% of primary raw material used. and 36% of produced solid waste. Mainstream building practices are unsustainable. We need a true circular economy where we no longer distinguish between waste and supply. Then only will the people in our cities live sustainably and rebalance their relationship with nature. I'll just now share the screen. Okay, so I've begun by calling it an ecological constitution. I think that's what we need for our cities. That's what needs to shape India's urban life. The reason being, this was coined by Linda Collins, and she talks about ecology, which is a pattern of relationship between living beings and their environment. I feel personally we need to question the present administrative systems, both central, state, and municipal. And unless we work with the people of our cities upwards, there's not going to be any major change that will affect all of us. So I do believe, just like we have a regular constitution, India needs an ecological constitution for our cities. I spoke about the systems of survival, where we talked about us being guardians. I've always said that we have, as architects, we have to be guardians of the built and the unbuilt environment. But Jane Jacobs also talked about something interesting. She said a city cannot be a work of art, because when we deal with cities, we're dealing with life at its most complex and intense. So there is a basic aesthetic limitation on what we can do. Coming to my city, and I'm sure many of you who are watching in Bangalore, we love our cities. This is a poem by Shabana Azmi, who says she loves her diversity, her pluralism, hopefully to continue, her festivals and her vibrancy. I may groan about the traffic, moan about the pollution, fret about the shrinking of open spaces, but I can't live anywhere else in the world. So Mumbai, we know, now has over almost 21 million people. How it was, how it is with its open spaces and heritage buildings, and the city of contrasts. So that is the city, and many cities in India that are now coming and going along this way. So coming to another book, Jan Gehl, where he talks about cities for people. He says, what are cities for, if not for people? So everybody is coming back to the same thing, that the cities are for people. We can't work from the top down. We need to work from the bottom up. We need to have a different system of administration. How will that work? Otherwise, like we're breathless in Bombay, inadequate pedestrian pathways, all cities in India, heavy traffic congestion, waste, crime, pollution, noise, unorganized activities, and illegal structures. I think this one photograph shows how it is for all of us. So I'm going to show you today 2 unbuilt projects of mine, just to show you that unless there is political and bureaucratic will, it is almost impossible for a citizen to work. They have to really struggle, and it's a wonder that they continue to struggle. So this Mumbai Esplanade project, we all know that lakhs and lakhs of people come into the city of Mumbai by the trains into 2 stations, the CSMBS station, Victoria Terminus, and the Churchgate station. So Professor Sidhu and I, we got together and we suggested to the authorities that we can link these 100 acres of land and make it into a single contiguous landscaped area, actually create 50 acres more of land in the heart of the city by taking cars just down in short strips, so that when people come out from the stations, they come into plazas. This is being done all over the world. And we thought we had something really interesting. It was very economical to do. We made a lot of presentations. We showed how the plazas could be, how people could come into them, use them, creation of open spaces in a severely starved city of open space. We had exhibitions. We got a lot of support from the press. But after 2 years of struggling, I gave up because it just did not move beyond the traffic department. They were only worried about cars, and more cars. And if you ask me if there's any single thing that has caused the biggest problem to our cities all over our country, it is that situation. So I hope the next generation will take this up. Another book, which of course, Charles Correa's New Landscape, he talks about urban living. And I think the two previous speakers have also mentioned that you start from the room, the cell, the element in the whole system of spaces that people need. And then you come to the family for private use, the areas of intimate contact, such as the front door, the neighborhood meeting spaces, and then, of course, the urban areas, such as the Maidans, which is used by the old city. So everybody who writes about this, who thinks about this, architects, urban designers, urban planners, are more or less saying the same thing. Who is the protagonist of the space? Who is the most important person in all this? It is a citizen. 41% of people in Mumbai live in slums. The euphemism for now is saying informal settlements. But there is nothing wrong in the word. And Jan Gehl says, why do slum dwellers stay in a slum by choice after it is no longer necessary? And this is what the authorities don't answer. They are having slum relocation, building towers, 6 meters difference between them. People are getting sick. But slums has to do with the most personal content of their lives, in realms which planners and urban designers can never directly reach or manipulate. And this is what we have to understand. So macro level plans, while necessary, unfortunately, when they're developed into micro level scale, they are usually unsuccessful. So we have to understand that the solutions carried out is not tailored for our Indian cities. We cannot all the time develop, learn from the Western world. We have to have our own way of thinking. And we have to understand in cities like ours, we have life in the in-between spaces, which actually lead to the creation of communities. We can't even begin to compare with what has happened in different parts of the world. So the last project, again, another unbuilt project, which I want to talk to you about, was a project which was complex because it was a collaborative competition where we had many, many different people working on it together with us. And I think this is what's important. We understand that the architect or the urban planner or the urban designer cannot work in isolation. They have to work in a collaborative way. We had ecological designers, landscape, we had structural engineers, we had a naturalist, we had all sorts of people working together on this particular project. We called it a line across history, creating a new forest and new public engagement on the banks of the heavily polluted Methi River in Mumbai. So it was this line where we come from our heritage buildings like the Rewa Fort. We go through the Ravi, which is where people live, their homes. And then we move on to a fill of actually all rubbish and garbage, which we wanted to make into a forest, and then to livelihood and through a bridge. So the three things are they need a place to live, they need a place to work, and they have to get to their place of work. So we went through, we studied about the Ravi. All of you must have heard about it, how they live, how they manage to. And the circular economy, they create more than $1 billion of income because of the work they do. They actually recycle 80% of Mumbai's plastic waste. They collect it, sort it, crush it, production and end. These circular economies are cities within cities. And these are the cities that we want to get rid of instead of upgrading them in any way, giving them the land, understanding what their strengths are and applying these strengths perhaps to other parts of our city, because the city is made up, of course, several neighborhoods. So we took the garbage area, talking about enlarging the forest and creating different uses for the people who live, creating open spaces. There are many, many things that people can do in the cities. And then finally, the bridge to Bandra Kurla complex where they get their work. You can see their thoughts. They want to be able to live, livelihood. They need to have a decent home and then a place of work. So we all know that 700 million Indians will inhabit cities by 2050. what the rural area definition will be, whether tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, I don't think anybody really knows, because whether people are going to continue to migrate or not, the word migrants is very offensive in many ways. They are our country, they are part of our people, they're not migrating to some other part of the world. And this is going to be the largest urban movement that the world has ever seen. So we are going to have severe challenges. We know that we're going to have housing shortage, water, sewage, power, vehicles, of course, we all know that. But what we have to understand is our country is now a nation of young people. Young people's aspirations and dreams are often different from mine, or maybe many other people our age. We have to understand that. We have to make sure that the smart city which people are talking about, is it more prepared to respond to challenges that we are talking about, or a conventional transactional relationship with its citizens? That is the most important question that needs to be answered. I believe a city should be remembered for its equality, infrastructure, of course, a sense of place, and a sense of belonging. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. Start with some questions that came up from all of your presentations. First, a question to you, Rahul, which you started off with this assertion that urban design perhaps should be seen more as a practice rather than as a discipline. And I'm not sure how you differentiate between the two, but to me, it raises the question that, practice often tends to get trapped by the transactional and tangible results, whether it's outcome oriented or process oriented, as you define that graph in that graph. Whereas the discipline has to step back at more holistic questions, asking what the nature of the city is, and those kind of issues. So how do you balance these two in the discipline of urban design?
Well, for me, I think it's our Council of Architecture that makes and implies in many of these sort of institutions the transactional nature. Because, I think what Chaya articulated, and I think in a completely different way, but what he articulated was the role of the urban designer as a facilitator of networks, of interactions, of collaborations, and so therefore that has to be practiced. And, disciplines, a discipline is bounded and defined by theory, by its own integrity of operation. There is also a kind of intellectual and more theoretical, let me say, definition. And so urban design, if it has to be plastic, if it has to reverse and not place architecture as the center. Look at what has happened really with urban design. And I think, again, Chaya alluded to this, in very potent ways, which is that it's made architecture its central instrument to organize the city, right? And that's why the jargon of urban design has become blocks and streets and heights and massing and, all that kind of stuff, because that is privileging architecture as the central premise or instrument to organize and imagine a city, right? But if you remove that lens and you begin to start making it human-centric, you look at questions of water, you look at ecological concerns, you begin to design the landscape and the sociological as well as the natural landscape in a way first, and privilege it and make architecture occupy interstitial spaces, you reverse the whole process, which means then it is really about a form of advocating, it's a form of facilitating, it's a form of creating these collaborations. And that is the big shift that has to occur. And I believe that can only happen when we think about it as the thermometer, which is affecting change and that impulse. Because, and therefore I say, use the word going from the critical to the propositional. Disciplines tend to I think spend more time on the critical because their integrity for good reason is also very important. And so therefore, just even going back to it historically, it came as an impulse or came as a reaction to create a bridge, which was about movement, which was about practice, which was about doing, which was about transforming. And so that's a completely different impulse. At least that's the way I understand it and choose to understand it, only because it helps me operate it. Yeah.
Do we create a problem by putting it as a binary, that it's either a practice or a discipline? Can't it be both, where the practice critiques the discipline and the discipline critiques the practice?
Well, Prem, everything should be like that. And that's why you have the reflexive practitioner. I think the planner should be a reflexive practitioner. The urban design by nature is a reflexive practitioner. So I absolutely. And so, I mean, I think that's what I outlined, that disciplines, I think one has to be mindful of their integrity, which creates the siling effect, but then one has to make them more plastic. And I think urban designers can infect disciplines to make them more plastic.
Thanks, Rahul. Chaya, a question for you. You talked about how expertise in the Indian city was often distributed, where you had a whole different set of skills, amongst the citizenry, and all that contributed to the making of the city. And you talked about how this should be involved in, where we look at cities not as visual or object-based, but action-based. So that automatically casts urban design as a participatory practice, a consultative practice. And in fact, that's been one of the critiques of many major recent urban design projects in India, like Central Vista or the Kashi Vishwanath corridor, that they have happened behind closed doors and without that without that foundation of public consultation. But having said that, there is also a dilemma about whether the society as a whole, but the city especially so because of its concentration of people and its concentration of diversity, has an inevitable pluralism about it. And that the belief that, that we can have a democratic practice where if communication distortions are removed, then a common conviction based on rationality can follow. Whereas some would say that, that's a pipe dream. So how would you locate the protocols of urban design as a discipline, challenging this question of pluralism and at the same time the demand for consultation?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. 2-3 things. First of all, today we are in a situation where the differences are being blown out of all proportion, and they are being shown to be sources of violence and sources of disintegration, which I think is something where the society as a whole has given up its role of being hospitable to many kinds of ways of looking at things. I think there is a foundational problem there, not just in urban design. It's a foundational problem which the whole of our society is going through. And I think this is, but because of that, we cannot give up the belief or the desire for a plural city. And I think just because sometimes there have been, or in recent times, they have exacerbated these confrontations, need not be the basis for saying we should not have it at all. So that's one part of it. If I look at how people organize so many things that they believe in, for example, if I looked at how after the earthquake in Kutch, the people of Ahmedabad organized themselves, which means that there is some sense in which there could be different modes of organizing oneself. Now, as professionals, we have not connected to those kinds of things. And I think this is somewhere where we need to open ourselves, become more vulnerable, become more connected to the sort of processes which are happening at a societal level, including writing and talking in our own local languages, for example, and including the acceptance of many kinds of behavior which we personally consider to be wrong, but to engage with that. I think the whole question is that the practitioner or the discipline, whichever way you want to call it, because I don't think I would fully agree with you that the practitioner has to be transactional. Not so, because the practitioner in his highest sense has to be completely aware of the implications of what he does on everything else. So this practitioner has to engage with rather than be a distant onlooker. And I think this is something which we have been not doing for a long time. And part of it is our own education. Part of it is our the way in which voices have been raised, loud voices, and nobody has spoken back. For example, the two projects that you talked about, the Delhi project was talked about mostly by architects within their own circles, except your own contribution to a general discourse. But the Kashi Vishwanath temple project has not been talked about at all. And there is nothing that we as either planners or as architects have said about these projects. And I think it is important that we start realizing that we are connected to the entire set of things that are going on in the country. We are not just independently practitioners. And I think this is something which has to come through, and not to lose faith in the sense that we have a plural society. It's a wonderful sense that we have. We must not give it up, even if it looks like really terrible right now. And I would say, if it looks messy, does not matter. Let's live with it, try to make it. And this I see in the street every day as I walk up and down. And this is something which all of us need to start participating in.
Thank you, Brinda. And this question connects to the point Rahul made about the urban designer being in advocacy and activism. And what's interesting is you showed a couple of projects you've done which were really not commissioned by the city or the state. They were just sort of speculative proposals you put forward, imaginations of what the city could be, and you just put it out there. So two questions from that. One is that something you believe more of us in the profession should do, this kind of speculation, public speculation on what the city is, imagining what the city is? And tied to that, how do we put forward the definition of a public realm that is truly public in its full depth of civic engagement? Unfortunately, the planning paradigms we have of the city tend to posit a public realm of a passive citizen who merely consumes movement, leisure, and consumption.
A small correction, Prem, the Mumbai Esplanade project was certainly my initiative with Professor Sidhu, but the MNP, which was the nature park, was actually a competition that was floated by a combination of public-private partnership, but finally nothing was done. And so both of them actually ended up in not moving at all. The danger of doing in a way what I did was, one, it's a huge amount of effort with no results, but for the two projects that everybody is mentioning, which is the Central Vista and the Kashi Vishwanath project, we have to think how were these projects conceived? Were they conceived by the government, by the state, or by the designer? So what is the role of designers? Are they to go with ideas and thoughts to the government? And if they do so, can it be done unilaterally? Or should it not be done in a collaborative spirit? So the same rules apply to cities as well. Our cities are so different from each other. In my opinion, it's almost crazy to have the same set of rules for Hyderabad as you have for Bangalore, as you have for Mumbai or Delhi. The citizens of each city have to work on their own city, the way they live, the way they eat, the language they talk in, what their value systems are. And they have to come out with, certainly with projects that are relevant to their city. So it's very complex. We know the political situation. Many people did come out and speak even about the Kashi Vishwanath temple, but our voices are not heard, and it will be very difficult to make our voices heard as long as it's only the architectural profession who believes in some of these things. So courage is required, outspokenness is required, being able to say what you believe in, and understanding your own city. So if the people within each city, like for instance, the people of Delhi, the people of Varanasi, the people of Mumbai, each group of activists have to stand up for their own city. As Jane Jacobs, again, going back to her, she said when people within the government don't even understand what they're doing often in terms of rules, it's a wonder that people from the general public even come and fight for certain things that they believe a city should have.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to pose another question now, which, and I invite any of you to comment on it, which is what is the primary task of the urban designer? And there is a school of thought which looks at historical diagrams like Nolli's maps of Rome and says the idea is just to make the city legible, not to over-specify the city in terms of design. So the city has to take a form where you can it's easy to construct a mental map of it in your head, which is again something that Kevin Lynch picked up on much later. But and therefore you just need to intervene just to that extent and leave a lot just for the citizenry to work out by themselves. But you shape this public realm in this context. But there's also been a sort of bounce back critique to that, saying that that will not work. For example, in the Indian city, it will not take into account the kinetic city. It's only looking at the static city, and it's not looking at the inequality and the sort of power imbalances of the city. So where do you see the urban design professionals stepping into this debate? Any of you can take this.
I can jump in if you like, Prem.
Sure.
No, I mean, I think, let me, at least for me personally, and I think, I think Chaya articulated this from a very much a kind of ground level perception, which is what is planning, right? Any policy has huge implications, right? And it's also sometimes planning policy necessarily is not only focused on the physical, the implications might be physical, correct? And so I think the urban designer's role in the context, at least currently in the Indian city, but I would say this would resonate more globally too, but in different measures, because I think places are specific and context matters, is, I think urban designers, at least in the way the pedagogical framework is set up right now, have the ability or the skill, let me say, to try to discern the physical implications, because space matters, of what might be policy impulses, right? And this goes all the way from livelihoods. I would say what has happened with the movement of people in the lockdown points to imagining better housing typologies and different ones and getting outside the one bedroom kitchen hall imagination. It all has incredible spatial implications, right? And so I think a useful role of the practice of urban design is to discern and anticipate the implications of what might be the abstraction of policy thinking. And sometimes that policy thinking and planning comes from other impulses, right? It comes from political impulses, it comes from economically driven imaginations, it comes sometimes from cultural and religious driven imaginations. And I think, therefore, our job becomes one of advocacy. When I say our job, I mean urban designers' job becomes one of advocacy, because it is about discerning these problems or discerning these implications, manifesting them, representing them, communicating them, accessing the different constituencies that Chaya was articulating, and creating a kind of forum, in a sense, where these could be productively discussed. And that's where it goes beyond being just the thermometer and taking the temperature, but actually becoming the thermostat in the way that you can turn the temperature up or down on these sorts of issues. And so, of course, space matters. And I think I would argue even things that you mentioned just now, the kinetic city, the more ephemeral, the temporal, of course, space even matters for them. And that also is a design question. How do you make the spaces that can accommodate that kind of elasticity, for example? So, I mean, I would think, I'm sorry, maybe it's a bit of a clumsy response, but that's the gamut of things, I would say.
Yeah, Prem, I think that, when change is happening, for example, there is a part of Ahmedabad called Asarwa, and it's very old, very ancient part of Ahmedabad. And it used to be next to the mills, and the mills closed down, and everyone who was living in Asarwa no longer had a livelihood. And what happens to such places can be informed by many, many kinds of knowledges. It can be informed by knowledges of economics, of industrial work, etc. But also the architect can come in and say, this is a street where people used to go out and work in the mill and come back. But now they have to find ways of producing things at home. How does that street still retain its integrity to some extent and integrate other possibilities? And so the urban designer can help postulate change and, as Rahul says, put forward different ways in which that change might affect that part of the city. And certainly that is a very important role for the urban designer to play.
Okay, I'm going to start picking up some of the questions from the audience, but perhaps combining them with some questions on my list. And perhaps this question I'll pose to you, Brinda, looking at that project you showed along the Mithi River. And since you also mentioned the ecology of cities. So Saras Ganpati asks about whether climate change is going to affect urban design, and if it's likely, is this being planned for? And I'll add to that question a problem pointed out by writers like William Cronon, who says that nature is not the scientific fact out there, it's something that we socialize. And we have our own cultural constructs of nature. And he says that the problem is that we tend to see nature, we associate nature with wilderness. And when we admit it into the city, we admit it as an aesthetic spectacle and not as an ecological process. And perhaps we should be able to look at the weed in the crack of a pavement with as much of a sense of wonder as a primal forest, because they're both worthy of wonder. So how do we bring this kind of ecological understanding into the city? Is it through new metaphors of the city, like John Thackara suggests, that we see the city not as a bounded entity, but as a sponge, so which has a sort of definiteness of form, but also porosity that flows through it? of these ecological flows? Could you
You're
respond
so
to that?
right, Prem. There, I was a jury member for some competition on sustainable construction, and one of the winners was a project. I think it was in Hanoi, if I recall correctly, where a group of activists actually created an ecological park within the city. It was a fabulous project, and it's actually happening. And it does exactly what you're saying. It has many considerations. It was land, and it is now doing so many different things to the city. I don't have time to talk about it, but if people are interested, they can go onto Google, and it was the Lafarge, the Wholesome Foundation, and the project was in Hanoi. And it does exactly what you're saying. And this is so important to what, we're talking about climate change. I did mention about what construction is contributing towards climate change and how we have to think differently. So unless we have a circular economy, it has to be circular. There cannot be waste. Whatever we create, we have to use. And every citizen within each city has to believe in the circular economy. Only then will we be able to move forward in a positive way. Because a lot of what we're talking about today comes down to grassroots levels if it's going to make a change. We can't have somebody sitting in Delhi or in Mantralaya or wherever, deciding what cities are going to do and what people are going to do. We can't even make people wear masks. How are we going to enable them to make changes within their environment, be aware of climate change, be aware of ecology? It has to come from within groups. We have to believe that every citizen is an architect. Every citizen is an urban designer. Every citizen is an urban planner. Only then are we going to have cities which are sustainable.
Okay, we have a question from Nikhil Shah, which is addressed to Chaya, but I see that Brinda has also marked interest in answering this question, which is how do you look at the dynamics of new forms of colonization of space, given the impact of digital technologies, what that's bringing to urban design space? That, in fact, we have non-spatial geographies, right? Manuel Castell said, we are in the space of flows rather than the space of places. So how do we resolve this problem that actually the digitization is actually taking us away from the spaces we inhabit, the relationships we hold?
I think digitization, if it becomes an obsession, can take you away from your body. And so keeping your body in good shape is one of the ways. And I think keeping the body of the city in good shape is also a non-digital activity. Let me take an example. I have a street, I live on a street where every evening there is a vegetable market. The carts come with vegetables, and all the people who live, these are what Brinda did not want to call migrants into the city, or maybe it was Rahul. But anyway, these are people from other parts of the country who live in this area. They are not well off. They dress up to the vegetable market. Now, this has become a social occasion. It is a marketplace. It is a place where you can hear many languages. You can smell many kinds of smells, because different kinds of food are also being sold. So there, the digital goes away for a while. And I think the city must offer more and more such opportunities, which are thick with embodied experience and not so clean, not so abstracted out, not so neatened, so that you don't feel the existence of being an embodied entity. And I think this is something which, as more and more digitization happens, the need for this will remain. And you can see it in the fact that people now systematically work on seeing that they have a bodily activity, but they do it alone. But they must do it as part of a city activity. And I think that way, probably the digital will have its place in life, but not take over everything.
Brinda, you wanted to say something on this?
No, I think Neelkant has said plenty. I did say earlier also that taking it one step away, maybe about a smart city that we keep hearing about, and everybody keeps coming and asking us, what is a smart city? What exactly does it mean? Is it going to use technology? How does it affect the people? Going back to the fact that we are going to be a young population in cities, we have millennials. So the question really becomes, which I asked earlier, does a smart city using technology become more prepared to respond to challenges than one with the conventional transactional relationship with its citizens, which is what we talked about that we're used to? But change has to come. We have to accept change. We all know that the one thing that doesn't change is change. It's going to come and we cannot fight it. We have to include it. It has to be one more inclusive part of what the city of the future is going to become. That is why we have to get different age groups, different professions, different economic levels of people to be involved with each one of our cities to really make them beautiful, like happens in many other parts of the world.
Thank you. I'll perhaps add to this, saying that perhaps architects and urban designers need to collaborate with app designers and sort of, try and break this binary, if it's either digital or it's a physical space, and look at, perhaps we need an app that looks at digital links that enhance the physical experience of spaces. We have a question from Rushil Palava-Jhala, who talks about political will and the inability and unwillingness of governance to recognize the issues that our cities face. And this takes on two dimensions, really. One is the lack of autonomy in urban governance. Even after the 74th Amendment, we have state government interference, and local urban governments really don't have the authority. In fact, as one Partha Mukhopadhyay in one article said, it's foolish to talk about smart cities because the precondition to smartness is autonomy, and agency in the Indian city has neither. But related to that is the question of who does planning, and the state domination of planning, and should be the state be the enabler of a process that's much more diversified, not just amongst planning experts, but going into the citizenry at large. So would anyone like to comment on the first steps we can take to sort of solve this political impasse we find ourselves against?
I think we're so voiceless just now. We can't even make a change in certain obvious situations in different parts with the architecture and the urban systems, urban design and urban planning that is going on. I always tell young people, Prem, when I talk to them, I said, we don't have a single politician who is also an architect. All our politicians are lawyers. From the time we had Pilu Modi, the one and only MP, we will always be peripheral to society if we do not have some political standing. We need urban designers, urban planners, architects in the political system, if it's only going to be the political system that's going to determine how we develop our cities. Unless that changes, then we have to become part of that. So I tell young people, go out. Why can't we have you people in the political system?
Chaya, Rahul, anything you wish to say on this? Rahul, is this a part of the advocacy and activism that
Yeah.
you talked about?
No, this is a discussion in itself. But I know, Chaya, go on.
Yeah. Well, I think there will always be a sense in which one feels dispirited, but that does not mean the end. I mean, I don't think so. Brinda, I would like to say that the Israeli Prime Minister was an architect, Netanyahu, and he is right now facing charges of corruption. So just because you are an architect doesn't mean that you will be better in governance. But I think that small but continuous interactions, at least I have found in Ahmedabad, that there is a possibility of the voice carrying across. Not always, very often not heard, but still there is some scope. And I think this is something which we have to persist with. And not, I think everybody in society will feel that they have no agency. Everyone, not just architects or urban designers or planners. And I think they will all have to keep on doing their work as whatever they are interested to do. And this I think we should do, irrespective.
Yeah, Neelkanth, but I think it's a pity you chose the one corrupt architect to talk about. I'm sure we have hundreds of very honest and good people who want to make a difference to our cities.
I'm sure
and they must have the agency and the ability and the power to do so. So I think the most important thing is to decide how are they going to get that. And time is running out. We need to do it as soon as possible. If we're going to wait to just contribute, while I'm not diminishing the importance of the value of what you said, but I think it's got to be done at a macro level as well, if we're really going to make a visible and positive change in our country.
Okay, we have an interesting comment and a question that follows from Biju Kuriakos. The comment is, he says, 10 years from now, hopefully both Central Vista and the Kashi Vishwanath corridor will get appropriated by people. In the Indian city, people eventually take over. After all, we have already appropriated Chandigarh. And from there, he leads to the question saying that we should get out of this binary that it's either formal and top-down driven or it's informal and bottom-up driven. Really, it's the interdependence between these two that makes the successful Indian city. And he gives the example of the Mumbai Dabbawalas who are successful because of the formal transit system.
Nice comment.
Yeah, but I think we still have to look at what is done by the formal, not necessarily just because it is done and it will be appropriated, does it mean that it's a good act? And I think that, for example, many of the design actions will have implications which distort the entire manner of conducting life. If you make spaces which are so controlled that the very inhabitation of them becomes difficult and you are exposed to surveillance at all times, and this is the kind of spaces that are being made, Chandigarh is a different kind of example. And I don't know whether under the conditions in which new spaces are being made, it will be possible to take them over. And I think this is something which is, because they're made in a way in which surveillance is extremely easy. and can be fully efficient. And I think this is something which we all, as practitioners of the art of space, have to realize.
Okay, that actually leads very interestingly into the question raised by Smriti Kopikar, who asks whether urban design consciously or otherwise addresses issues of equity, justice, and rights, and other examples of this in India. And that, of course, brings us to this whole question of the right to the city, which is one we have not articulated, which is actually hugely important in this discussion. And is it that we're not seeing the city in terms of rights? And if we did see the city in terms of rights, we would be aware of the devastating degrees of marginalization, where over 50% of most cities live outside the paradigm of official planning. They're forced to, and they're criminalized in the process of doing so. And because we don't see it in rights, therefore we are willing to look at just isolated examples of these sort of, prestigious projects which are held up as symbols of modernization.
Yes, I think one of the things which I did not say was that most of the people who come into the practice of architecture, planning, urban design, they come from a section of society which is privileged, and they have very little understanding of what the marginalized undergo. And I think this is evident in many of the strictures that we lay upon space as to its use, its occupation, its inhabitation, and so on. And this is one major change that is required, that we need to understand the fact that the city is for all and not just for the few. And that this, in order for it to be so, there will have to be ways in which you give dignity to living at a very simple level, and yet provide for the needs. And I think this is something, it's not just a question of physically doing so, but even in the very structuring of space, that you see that this marginalization becomes more and more pronounced. And I think this is something, displacement of populations all over the country. In cities, for example, with development projects, they are always looked upon in terms of the privileges that it will give to a few, and not in terms of the basic fact that the city belongs to everyone.
Leading from there, Darshini Shah talks about how our cities are taken over by real estate mafias. And that dominates the whole process rather than what professionals may think. It's a money-driven process based on profit maximization and rent seeking. So is the answer the doctrine of not just rights, but also of transparency? Is that a sort of very essential citizen demand, a public pressure that has to be raised, without which all that we are talking about is going to be severely limited?
Yeah. There are now structures by which transparency is promoted. Okay, you have access to digital information, but the information is so huge. Suppose I took Ahmedabad and I want to find out everything about what plans were passed last year. The information is so huge that I will have to make a profession out of it. So this word transparency is a red herring. It is a way of saying, oh yes, things are taken care of. It is evident that they are not taken care of, and that there will have to be, you'll have to vote with your feet on this. And we are going well beyond our what we are supposed to talk about, but I can't help it.
Manorika Mohta has raised the question of heritage, that Indian cities are diverse. How do you keep a balance between retaining their heritage and at the same time urbanize and modernize them? Brinda, as someone who's worked in conservation, would you like to take that on?
I don't know if Rahul remembers, but years ago when we were both on the Urban Heritage Conservation Committee, we went around Gamdevi looking at all the buildings there together. We had to come out with basic guidelines for that area, the Laburnum Road and all those beautiful old bungalows there. Yesterday's paper, I read that 2 of them are being knocked down. We know many of them have been knocked down, and tall towers are coming. So it's a very difficult battle to fight. I always say that the embodied energy of not just heritage buildings, but ordinary buildings in our cities need to be kept and retained, because every building we break down, we lose all the embodied energy, and then we bring in new materials, to build new. So that goes back to the question of the person who asked about climate change. So there's no circular economy if you do that. So I think it's not just heritage buildings, it's a point of recycling what we have in a country like ours. And all over the world, ordinary buildings can also be recycled and reused and adaptive reuse and repaired and retrofitted. So I think we have to stop just talking about our heritage is more than a grand building. Our heritage is what we have inherited.
Thanks, Brinda. I'll just add to that the problem we have in India is that we look at heritage in a very monument-centric perspective, and we don't look at it from an urban precinct perspective.
No, but also you could also extend that to what Chaya is saying, which is heritage is also the intangible, right? The places for people, the markets, the ways of transaction, etc. So, I mean, I think that the question seemed to be focused on built heritage, which is what naturally Binda responded to. But you could pick up that problem and, the buildings, if again, like one was arguing that if urban design is not architecture centric, it opens up a whole area for our attention, which could be much more productive.
And also the 2 words, modernization and development, that were used, those have to become suspect words because they are promoting a manner of thinking. I don't mind that cities change, but if you think in terms of progress and modernization as something which is a value in itself, irrespective of anything else, then I think it has to be questioned. And there are many instances where you don't need much more space, you don't need necessarily new space, and yet you go ahead and say this is in the interests of modernization. And I think this is something which we have to question. Brinda is absolutely right there.
Yeah, you're right. As one person put it, modernization started off as an ethical project and has wound up as an aesthetic project, where the aesthetic is a mask for certain elitist interests. We could go on discussing. It's a fascinating topic and a great discussion, but unfortunately, we've come to our time limit. In fact, we've actually extended a little beyond. So I think in closing, I will request each of the panelists to just give a few closing remarks on thoughts to keep in mind as we move on reflecting on this topic. So let's do it in the reverse order of the speakers, and Brinda, you can go first.
So there was a big fire in a forest. It's a folk story. And all the animals ran away. And the only one that was trying to help was a little bird who kept going to a stream and picking up little water and trying to put off the fire. So everybody started laughing at the bird and said, that's not going to put off the fire. So the bird said, well, at least I'm doing my bit. I said this story to a group of people whom I was talking to, and I thought that was the entire story. And the next day I got on my email box a lot of emails, which gave the rest of the story. So the rest of the story was the gods were watching this little bird, and they got so moved that they began to cry. And when gods cry, it comes down as rain, and the rain put off the fire. So each one of us has to do our bit. Thank you.
Chaya?
Yeah, well, I think what I would like to learn is how to put myself in other shoes, as many as possible, and walk in those different places that so many others do. If I can do that, then I'm alive to what the city is like, and then maybe I might have something useful for the city. And that's, I think, is the main message that I would like to leave with.
Rahul?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to, that I just want to pick up actually on the question that of Chandigarh and things that came up, which we already spoke about, and really use that as a way to say, I mean, I think it's very critical, this question of the binaries and not choosing to live in one or the other worlds, but trying to find these other spaces in between, which comes from bringing these various lived experiences and, all of that. I mean, everything we've discussed actually contributes to that. But I think we have to be careful, like the case of Chandigarh or the Dabbawalas, things that have happened by default for various reasons are good ones to learn from. But I think design has a great role to play in making this third space, a space that dissolves these binaries. And I think that's really going to be the most potent contribution of urban design. And that's why going back to the metaphor of the bridge, of dissipating what might be the boundaries of the disciplines in terms of the binaries, I think is a very critical thing for us to think about.
Thank you. If as the using moderator's privilege, I can add my 2 bits of a closing note, is that we need to seek to understand the creative dynamism of the city. And some of the early writings on urbanism did focus on that the fact that the city offered you, was cosmopolitan, it offered you anonymity, and there was a certain freedom. And then you could use that freedom to build new associations, and which you didn't have in the village, where you're, consistently under the gaze of tradition and were forced to conform to it. And that's why cities have always been dynamic spaces. So I'll just offer this wonderful formulation by a sociologist, Robert Park, who wrote this a little over a century ago. And he said that the role of the city is to foreground the moral range of deviant behavior. With that, I thank all the panelists for this discussion. I know it was very difficult to cover this topic comprehensively. It's a very complex topic, and hopefully this will just be one in many more such discussions. I think many of the questions that came up merited a discussion in their own right. Thank you, Rahul. Thank you, Brinda. Thank you, Chaya.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
all. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Prem.